The file had one word in the threat assessment field for 40 years. A harmless subject designation, human, female designation Sira Mbeki Holt. First flagged by Veth Imperial Intelligence at age 23 when she was working as a junior logistics coordinator on a commercial transport route through contested space. The intelligence officer who created the file, a methodical analyst named Corvesh Talon, had reviewed her travel patterns, her communication records, her commercial transactions, and her documented behavior across 6 months of routine monitoring. His conclusion, typed into the threat assessment field in the precise bureaucratic language the Empire required: subject demonstrates no military training, no political affiliation of concern, no access to sensitive resources. Threat level, negligible. Recommend standard commercial monitoring only. He closed the file. He moved on to the next subject. He did not think about Sira Mbeki Holt again for 37 years. This was not unusual. Imperial intelligence monitored approximately 4 million individuals across human commercial space at any given time. Most files, once opened, were updated only when something changed significantly enough to warrant attention. Sira Mbeki Holt's file did not change for 37 years. Not because nothing happened to her. Things happened. She married, she had 2 children, she left logistics work after 11 years and moved into commercial supply chain management. She relocated 4 times. She built across nearly 4 decades the kind of unremarkable life that intelligence services generally categorized as exactly what the word implied. Unremarkable. The Empire's automated monitoring systems flagged her file periodically for routine review, confirmed no change in threat status, and archived the update without human analyst involvement. This continued until the year Corvesh Talon, now a senior intelligence director with 39 years of service, received a priority escalation notice that included her file number. He did not immediately recognize the names. He opened the file expecting an administrative error. What he found instead was a flag generated by the Empire's newly implemented cross-referencing system, a project that had taken 11 years to build and represented the most significant intelligence infrastructure investment the Veth Empire had made in a generation. The system's purpose was simple in concept and extraordinarily complex in execution. It cross-referenced every monitored individual's documented commercial, social, and professional connections across decades of accumulated data, searching for patterns that no individual analyst could ever identify manually. It had flagged Sira Mbeki Holt's file because of something the system called a network density anomaly. Corvesh read the generated summary 3 times before he fully understood what he was looking at. In 37 years, Sira Mbeki Holt had worked in supply chain management across 11 different human commercial sectors. She had held mid-level positions, never senior leadership, never anything that would have triggered enhanced monitoring under standard protocols. But the system had traced something the standard protocols never could have caught. Every single person she had directly supervised, mentored, or worked closely alongside during those 37 years had, at some measurable point in their subsequent career, achieved a position of significant strategic importance. Not most, of all of them, 211 individuals, tracked across 37 years, every one of whom had passed through some period of direct working relationship with Sira Mbeki Holt, and every one of whom had subsequently risen into roles the Empire's intelligence apparatus classified as strategically significant. Senior logistics coordinators for entire colonial supply networks, commercial negotiators who had personally structured trade agreements that reshaped resource access across multiple sectors. 3 of her former junior staff members were now sitting on the Human Galactic Affairs Institute's Senior Advisory Board. One had become the lead architect of the Karath Corridor framework that had become the standard model for Veth-human commercial relations across the entire Outer Territories. Korvesh stared at the network map the system had generated. 211 nodes, all branching outward from a single point. Zira Mbeki hold. A Harmless, he pulled the original file from 37 years earlier and read his own assessment again. Subject demonstrates no military training, no political affiliation of concern, no access to sensitive resources. He had been correct on every individual point. He now understood with the specific cold clarity of a senior intelligence officer realizing the scale of an error, been catastrophically wrong about what actually mattered. He requested an emergency consultation with the Empire's senior strategic analysis team. The team that assembled 4 days later included Rethorin Save, now the division's most senior analyst, whose work on the new combat study following the Karath Corridor incident had fundamentally reshaped how the Empire understood human strategic behavior. Save reviewed the network map for over an hour without speaking. Then I want to understand the mechanism, not the outcome, the mechanism. How does working alongside this specific individual correlate this strongly with subsequent strategic significance? Korvesh said, I don't know yet. I've requested her complete employment history and performance reviews from every position she's held. I should have preliminary analysis within a week. The preliminary analysis took 3 weeks, not 1, because what the research team found required verification at a level of rigor that the initial timeline hadn't anticipated. Sira Mbeki-Holt's performance reviews, across 37 years and 11 different positions, told a remarkably consistent story. She was never the most technically skilled person in any role she held. Her performance reviews described her repeatedly using variations of the same language. Reliable, thorough, not exceptional in any specific technical metric. What stood out across decades of reviews from different supervisors in different sectors who had never communicated with each other was a specific pattern of behavior that none of them seemed to have a vocabulary for, but all of them had noticed. She consistently identified junior staff members who were underperforming relative to their actual capability, not because they lacked skill, but because some specific structural or interpersonal obstacle was preventing them from demonstrating it. And she consistently, methodically removed those obstacles. One review from her second position, 11 years before any of her later strategic proteges had achieved prominence, described an incident in detail that the research team flagged as significant. A junior staff member named Daniel Ray Zakafer had been consistently passed over for advancement despite strong technical performance, because his communication style in meetings was perceived as overly direct, sometimes interpreted by senior management as insubordinate. Sira Mbeki-Holt had spent 6 months, without any formal authority to do so, working alongside him during informal mentoring sessions she had initiated on her own time, helping him develop the specific communication frameworks that would allow his technical insight to be heard rather than dismissed. Daniel Ray Zakafer went on to become, 22 years later, the senior negotiator who structured the Karath Corridor framework. This pattern repeated with variation across 211 documented cases. She identified capable people who were being structurally overlooked, and she invested, consistently and without any formal incentive to do so, in removing whatever was preventing them from being seen. Save said, reading the compiled pattern analysis, she was not building her own career through these relationships. None of her own performance reviews show evidence that mentoring junior staff was formally recognized or rewarded in any of her positions. She did this work largely invisibly, for 37 years with no apparent strategic benefit to herself. Korvash said, which is exactly why it never appeared on any threat assessment. There was no strategic calculation visible in her behavior, no pattern of building influence or accumulating leverage. She simply, consistently, helped people who were capable but overlooked become visible. And over 37 years, 211 of those people became, collectively, one of the most significant strategic networks in human-Veth relations that exists. Save was quiet for a long moment. I want to ask the obvious question, even though I suspect I already know the answer. Is this network coordinated? Is there evidence she has continued to direct or influence these individuals after they moved into their senior positions? Korvash said, that was my first assumption too. I spent the first week of this investigation looking specifically for evidence of ongoing coordination, regular communication patterns, shared strategic objectives. Anything that would suggest this was an intentional network rather than an emergent pattern. I found almost nothing. A handful of personal holiday messages, occasional professional correspondence consistent with normal relationship maintenance between former colleagues, nothing resembling coordination. I believe, based on everything I've found, that Sira Mbeki-Holt has no idea this network exists. I don't believe she has ever stepped back and looked at the cumulative effect of 37 years of mentoring relationships. I believe she simply continued doing, in each individual relationship, what felt like the right thing to do for that specific person at that specific time. Save said, and the cumulative effect, entirely unplanned and unrecognized by the person at the center of it, is a strategic network more significant than most formal diplomatic initiatives the Empire has undertaken in the past 2 decades. I need to update the threat assessment. Korvash said, that's why I escalated this. I don't know what the correct classification is anymore. Harmless is clearly insufficient, but she's also, by every available metric, not a threat in any conventional sense. She hasn't done anything adversarial. She's helped capable people succeed. The question I can't resolve is whether helping capable people succeed, at this scale, accumulated unintentionally over decades, should be classified as a threat at all, or whether our threat assessment framework simply doesn't have a category for what this actually is. This question occupied the senior strategic analysis team for 6 weeks. The debate, when it finally reached the Imperial Strategic Council, was unusually contentious for what appeared, on the surface, to be a routine file update. One faction argued that any individual whose activities, regardless of intent, produced this concentration of strategic influence in human-Veth relations required formal monitoring as a matter of standard intelligence practice, regardless of whether her behavior was adversarial. Another faction, led by Save, argued that classifying someone as a threat based entirely on the unintended cumulative effect of decades of mentorship and kindness toward overlooked colleagues represented a fundamental misapplication of threat assessment frameworks, and that doing so would set a troubling precedent for how the Empire categorized human behavior generally. The debate continued for 2 months. During those 2 months, Korvash requested and received approval for a direct, declared consultation with Sira Mbeki-Holt herself, conducted through the same formal diplomatic channels that had governed Veth-human strategic relations since the Karath Corridor Agreement. She was 60 years old when he met her, recently retired from her final position as a senior advisor to a mid-sized commercial supply consortium, living in a modest residence in a coastal human settlement that, according to her file, she had no particular strategic significance for choosing beyond proximity to her grandchildren. Korvash explained, as clearly as security protocols allowed, what his investigation had found. He showed her the network map. The 211 nodes. She studied it for a long time. She said finally I had no idea. I believe you. That's actually the conclusion my entire team reached, independently and with considerable difficulty, because it's an unusual thing for an intelligence assessment to conclude. I just tried to help people who deserved better than what they were getting. I didn't think about where it would lead. I don't think I ever once in 37 years thought about strategic outcomes. I want to ask you something directly because I think it's the question my council ultimately needs answered. If you had known, at any point during those 37 years, that helping these specific individuals would eventually produce this network, would you have done anything differently? She thought about this for a long time. No, I don't think I would have. Daniel needed someone to help him communicate in a way people would actually hear. That had nothing to do with strategy. He was a capable person being overlooked because of something fixable, and fixing it felt like the right thing to do. The same was true for every single person on that map, I imagine, even though I couldn't tell you most of their names anymore without looking at old records. I think you're looking for some kind of intention that was never there. I wasn't building anything. I was just trying to make sure capable people had a fair chance, one person at a time, for 37 years, because that seemed like a reasonable way to spend a career. Korvesh said, that's the conclusion my analysis reached as well. I want you to understand why this has been such a difficult question for my government, though. We have spent generations building frameworks to identify and assess threats, coordinated networks, strategic influence operations, hidden agendas that accumulate power over time. What we found when we finally looked closely enough was something our frameworks have no category for. A network more strategically significant than most deliberate intelligence operations we've ever encountered, built entirely without strategy, by someone whose only consistent motivation across 37 years was helping individual people succeed. We don't know what to call that, we don't know how to assess it, because it doesn't fit any model we've built for understanding influence and power. I don't think it needs a complicated name. I think you could just call it what it is. What would you call it? Kindness, probably. Applied consistently enough for long enough that it eventually adds up to something larger than any individual act of it ever looked like at the time. The Imperial Strategic Council's final decision, reached 3 weeks after Korvesh's consultation, did not classify Sira Mbeki Holt as a threat. It also did not maintain the original Harmless classification. The Council created, for the first time in the Empire's intelligence history, a new threat assessment category specifically to accommodate what her file represented. The category was titled, after considerable internal debate about appropriate terminology, Cumulative Influence, unintentional. The formal definition, written into Imperial Intelligence Protocol and subsequently applied to a retrospective review of thousands of other long-monitored human files, read: subjects whose individual actions, none of which independently meet threshold criteria for strategic significance, produce through consistent application over extended time periods a cumulative network effect of substantial strategic importance, without evidence of coordinated intent or awareness on the subject's part. The retrospective review, once initiated, found 43 additional human files across the Empire's monitoring records that matched the pattern. Teachers, mentors, community organizers whose decades of quiet, individual investment in overlooked people had produced, entirely without strategic planning, networks of strategic significance that no intelligence framework had ever been built to recognize. Rethorin Save, reviewing the completed retrospective analysis, wrote in his final report to the Strategic Council, "We have spent generations building intelligence frameworks designed to identify threats hidden beneath apparently harmless behavior. We have apparently never built a framework capable of recognizing significance hidden beneath apparently harmless kindness. He wrote, I believe this represents a fundamental limitation in how we have understood human civilization. We have studied their wars extensively. We have studied their diplomacy, their commerce, their conflicts. We have built 2,000-page reports on their combat behavior and 41-page proposals analyzing their negotiation tactics. He wrote, we have not adequately studied what happens when a single human, with no strategic intention whatsoever, simply decides for 37 consecutive years that capable people deserve a fair chance, and acts on that decision consistently enough that it reshapes, without anyone noticing until decades later, the strategic landscape between two civilizations. He wrote, I do not believe Sira Mbeki-Holt represents an isolated case. I believe she represents a mechanism that exists throughout human civilization, largely invisible to any intelligence framework built to detect threats, because the mechanism does not operate through threat. It operates through the accumulated weight of individual decisions to help, repeated consistently over time by people who never once calculated the strategic value of doing so. He wrote, I recommend the Empire develop ongoing monitoring specifically designed to identify this pattern earlier in its development, not because it represents danger, but because understanding it appears to be one of the most significant gaps in our comprehension of how human influence actually accumulates and spreads. He wrote, the file was correct for 37 years. She was harmless by every meaningful definition of that word. She never threatened anything, she never sought power. She never built anything resembling a deliberate strategy. He wrote, she simply helped people, one at a time, for 37 years, and the world quietly rearranged itself around the cumulative weight of that choice. Sira Mbeki-Holt's file was formally updated in the Imperial Intelligence Database the following month. The threat assessment field, which had read Harmless for 40 years, was changed to reflect the new classification. Below it, in a supplementary notes field that Corvesh Talon added personally, against standard protocol but with special authorization from the Strategic Council, was a single additional line. It read, subject continues to be, by any reasonable definition, exactly what the original assessment said. We were simply not equipped, 40 years ago, to understand what Harmless could eventually become.